Rain hammered the bulletproof glass of the black Bentley as it carved through Chicago's South Side, turning the city into a bleeding watercolor of red taillights and blue neon. Inside, Salvatore Moretti loosened his tie. 37 years old, and already carrying the weight of an empire built on blood and silence. His jaw still tight from a multi-million-dollar deal that had just gone sideways. He didn't stop for strangers. He didn't stop for anyone. But when the headlights swept across a crumbling bus shelter on the edge of his territory, they caught something that made his driver hit the brakes without being told. A woman, barely more than bones, wrapped in a soaked gray cardigan, curled around a tattered backpack like it was the only thing keeping her alive. He knew that hair, that dark auburn color he'd noticed 100 times when she was dusting the shelves in his private study, the faint scent of vanilla and old paper she always left behind like a ghost's signature. Genevieve Cole, his former maid, 27 years old, orphaned at 14 when her parents burned alive in a fire set by loan sharks, bounced through 3 foster homes where she learned that silence was the only thing that kept you safe, and the one woman who'd been invisible enough to stumble onto a secret that could bury him and everyone he'd ever loved. She didn't look relieved when she saw him. She looked terrified, scrambling backward on the wet bench, begging him not to kill her, swearing she hadn't stolen anything, her wrists covered in cigar burns and her voice cracking around words that made no sense until they made perfect, horrifying sense. Stopping the car wasn't mercy. It was instinct. But what Salvatore found inside that backpack, a manila folder thick with wire transfers, forged documents, and a handwritten letter that proved his own uncle had sold him to a rival family, would drag him into a war he never saw coming, fought not with guns and soldiers, but with the one weapon no one in his world expected, a broken woman who had nothing left to lose, and a secret growing inside her that would change the Moretti name forever. The storm over Chicago that night wasn't just weather. It was a funeral bell, and nobody heard it ringing except the 2 people sitting in the back of that Bentley, soaked in rain and silence, hurtling toward a truth that would either save them both or destroy everything. If this story's already got its hooks in you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you've got taste. Share this with someone who loves a good Mafia saga. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because this ride's just getting started. Remember, in Chicago, the deadliest storms don't come from the sky. They come from the people you trust. The penthouse elevator opened straight into the foyer, a long sweep of marble and modern art facing the city skyline, a place where absolute silence usually ruled, but tonight it had turned into a makeshift emergency room. Salvatore stepped out with Genevieve still unconscious in his arms, her body soaked through and cold as a corpse, her head lolling to one side against his shoulder, her copper-brown hair stuck to his neck like thin, fragile cords of restraint. He didn't wait for anyone to open the living room doors. He drove his knee into them, and then laid her on the expansive velvet sofa in the lounge with a gentleness that surprised even him, because his hands could be that careful, hands that had once crushed a man's throat and signed orders to erase an entire shipping line without a tremor. He stepped back, stared at her on the pristine white Egyptian cotton sheets, and the image was wrong in a way that hurt the eyes. A filthy, bruised, gaunt body in the middle of luxury, like a broken-winged bird dropped into a golden cage. "Pietro," he barked without turning his head. "Call Dr. Wakefield. Tell him to get to the penthouse immediately. I don't care where he is or what he's doing." Pietro, hands still wet from the rain, nodded and vanished down the hallway, his fingers dialing before the command had even finished. Salvatore stripped off his drenched vest and tossed it onto the marble floor, not bothering to look at the suit that had cost $12,000 and now looked like a rag. Then he dropped to his knees beside the bed and pulled the blanket up over Genevieve. In the room's warm light, she looked even worse than she had in the rain. Her cheeks so hollow, her cheekbones jutted like 2 blades under the skin. Her lips cracked with dried blood, the bruise along her jaw shifting from purple to a sickly yellow. At least a week old, and on her wrists, the cigar burns he'd seen in the car showed themselves clearly under the light, round, even, methodical, not an accident, but torture. 15 minutes later, Dr. Wakefield came in, gray hair wild as if he'd been dragged out of bed, but his eyes fully awake because he'd been the Moretti family doctor for 20 years, and he knew that when Salvatore called at midnight, it was never small. He examined Genevieve in silence, old hands steady and sure, moving along her body with the caution of a man who'd stitched too many wounds made by bullets and knives, while Salvatore leaned by the window with his back to the room, watching every motion in the glass reflection. When Wakefield pushed up Genevieve's sleeve, he paused, pressed his lips together, then kept going without a word. But Salvatore caught that frown all the same. 20 minutes later, Wakefield stepped into the hallway, pulled the door closed behind him, then turned to Salvatore with the face of a man about to deliver news he knew would trigger something dangerous. "She's severely malnourished," Wakefield said softly. "Her body's eating itself, muscle wasting. Her immune system is almost gone. The 4th and 5th ribs on the left are cracked, not healed, at least 2 weeks, untreated. The burns on her wrists are from cigars, systematic, same size, same spacing. This isn't random abuse, this is deliberate torture." Salvatore didn't speak, his right hand clenched at his side, every knuckle gone white. "Anything else?" Wakefield hesitated, then spoke in a gentler voice, as if he were trying to reduce the weight of each word. "She's pregnant, about 7 weeks. The fetus is alive but very weak because the mother's body is depleted. If she doesn't get nutrition and rest immediately, she could lose the baby within a few days." The air in the hallway thickened. Salvatore stood perfectly still, his face showing nothing. No surprise, no rage, no pity, just an empty wall. And that emptiness made Wakefield step back half a pace, because he knew when Salvatore Moretti showed no emotion was when he was most dangerous. "Take care of her," Salvatore said, his voice flat as a lake before a storm. "Give her everything she needs. And doctor, if anyone asks about the patient tonight, even someone in this house, your answer is that you don't know anything." Wakefield nodded and went back into the room. Salvatore stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door, and for the first time that night, he allowed his hand to shake, just for a second. Then he clenched it again. The quick, small click of high heels on marble made him turn. Agnes Brennan, the head housekeeper, 64, the woman who'd taken the place of a mother to Salvatore since he was 8, hurried toward him in her robe, gray hair loose, eyes still puffy from half-sleep. She stopped when she looked through the crack of the living room door and saw the woman on the bed, and her hand flew up to cover her mouth. "Dear God," she whispered. "That's Genevieve." Salvatore turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You recognize her. Good. Because you're going to explain to me why one of my employees was sleeping in a drainage ditch and believes I wanted her dead." Agnes trembled, not from cold, but from that voice, the one Salvatore used before someone disappeared for good. She said, stammering, "Sir, we were told she was dismissed 3 weeks ago. Mr. Franco handled it. He said she was caught stealing silver from the dining room. None of us dared question it because Mr. Franco is your uncle. He said you knew, and you agreed." Salvatore looked at Agnes, and she saw something change in his eyes. Not the flash of anger she'd witnessed many times, but something colder, slower, and far more terrifying, like a frozen lake hiding black water underneath. "I was never informed," Salvatore said, each word dropping like a stone. "No one in this house asked me a single question before throwing a 27-year-old girl into the street in the middle of a Chicago winter." Agnes bowed her head, tears falling onto the marble. Salvatore went quiet for a moment, then spoke, his voice dropping another notch, like a machine starting up slowly before it exploded. "Find Franco for me. Tell him to come to the penthouse tomorrow afternoon. Say I want to discuss South Route logistics. Don't let him know anything else. And Agnes, if you care about the girl lying in that room, you'll take care of her tonight the way you'd care for your own daughter. Because that's the only thing you can do to make up for the 3 weeks everyone in this house kept their eyes shut." Genevieve woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the first thing she did was scream. Not a loud scream, but the sound that strangled itself in her throat like a trapped animal, because her eyes opened to a high ceiling, a crystal chandelier, sheets soft as cloud, and her brain processed it all into one conclusion. She'd been taken back. She rolled off the bed, her legs tangled in the blanket, hit the icy marble floor, and crawled backward into the corner until her spine struck the wall, both arms wrapped tight around her belly, as if the deepest instinct in her knew what had to be protected first, her eyes raking the room for an exit, for a weapon, for anything. Then she saw him. Salvatore sat in an armchair by the window, one leg crossed over the other, white shirt sleeves pushed to his elbows, an untouched glass of whiskey on the table beside him, and his dark eyes held her with something that wasn't pity and wasn't a threat, but the cold patience of a man who'd been waiting for hours for her to wake. "You're Genevieve Cole," he said, his voice low and slow like he was talking to a spooked horse. "You're in my penthouse on the 62nd floor. No one has come into this room except me and the doctor. The door isn't locked. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But before you go, you're going to tell me who did this to you." Genevieve pressed her back to the wall, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, and she watched him for signs of deceit, for anger hidden under the calm surface, for the monster they'd warned her about. But what she saw was only a man who hadn't slept last night, darkness bruising beneath his eyes, and a question burning him from the inside out. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw from 3 weeks of speaking to no one but herself. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you're mine," Salvatore said, not raising his voice, not emphasizing it, only stating a simple fact the way gravity was a fact, and someone touched what's mine without permission. Genevieve closed her eyes, and when she opened them, something inside her broke, not breaking in a bad way, but like a dam cracking after holding back too much water for too long, and she began to tell him. She told him that 3 weeks earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon, Franco had called her into his private office on the 2nd floor of the mansion. She thought he wanted to complain about how she'd arranged the files because he always hunted for small faults. But when she walked in, there were 2 men standing on either side of the door. Men she'd never seen before. Faces cold as brick, and before she could turn around, a black cloth went over her head, and 2 arms clamped her like a vice. She told him they put her in a car. She didn't know how long they drove because she lost all sense of time when fear swallowed everything. Then they led her into a room that smelled of damp and cement, pulled the blindfold off, and Franco was sitting there on a folding chair, a cigar burning between his fingers, asking in the same casual tone someone used to ask about the weather, "Where's the folder?" She said she didn't know what folder. Franco nodded, and one of the men pinned her wrist to a metal table, while Franco pressed the lit end of the cigar into her skin. When Genevieve reached that part, her voice vanished for a moment. Her lips moved, but no sound came, and she looked down at her wrist like it belonged to someone else. Then she swallowed and went on. She said they asked the same question over and over for 2 days, and every time she said she didn't know, they added another burn. She counted 7 marks on her left hand and 5 on her right before she passed out for the first time, and when she came to, her ribs hurt so badly she couldn't breathe. She didn't know if they'd kicked her or hit her while she was unconscious. Salvatore listened without moving, without interrupting, without asking for more, only his fingers on the whiskey glass tightening little by little until his knuckles turned whiter than the marble beneath their feet. Genevieve went on, saying that on the 3rd day they untied her, shoved her into a trunk, drove her out, and dumped her in an alley on the west side of Chicago while it was still dark, and Franco leaned down and spoke into her ear, his voice so gentle it turned her stomach. "If you come back to the mansion, if you get near anyone in the Moretti family, Salvatore will kill you with his own hands, and no one will ever find your body." And he added that she was nothing, just a rag people threw away when they were done using it. She said she believed him. She believed every word, because she'd grown up in a world where adults told the truth when they threatened children. 3 foster families had taught her that lesson in bone and blood. For the next 3 weeks she lived like a ghost on Chicago streets, sleeping at a shelter on Ashland until there were no more beds. Then on a park bench, then under an awning behind a church, eating whatever she could find in the trash behind restaurants in Pilsen. And every day she tried to scrape together coins from begging or collecting aluminum cans to buy a Greyhound ticket out of Chicago, because she knew every day she stayed in this city was another day she might die. Salvatore asked, his voice so low it was almost just a vibration in the air. "So what is that folder?" Genevieve looked at him, then at the battered backpack on the nightstand, the backpack she'd held the way you held a child for 3 weeks straight. She said that 2 days before Franco called her into his office, she'd been cleaning his office the way she always did, sliding a bookcase to wipe behind it, and a manila folder fell out from a narrow gap between the shelf and the wall. She picked it up to put it back on the desk, but her phone buzzed. She shoved the folder into her apron pocket and forgot about it, and that night in her room she remembered. She meant to return it the next morning, but the next morning was the day Franco called her in, and everything collapsed. She said she kept the folder, not because she knew what it held, but because after she'd been tortured and thrown into the street, survival instinct told her that whatever someone was willing to kill her for was the only thing that might keep her alive, so she hid it in the torn lining at the bottom of her backpack. And every night she slept with the backpack in her arms, not because she understood the value of the papers inside, but because she understood that when you have nothing in this world, not even a name anyone wants to remember, you hold tight to anything that might buy you one more day of surviving. Salvatore rose from the armchair, walked to the nightstand, and lifted the backpack with the kind of care he usually reserved for loaded guns, because by now he understood that whatever was inside this torn bag was more dangerous than any weapon he'd ever touched. Genevieve stayed curled in the corner, watching him pull the manila folder from the ripped lining at the bottom, and she saw his hands didn't shake, didn't hesitate, only his jaw tightening a fraction as his fingers met paper wrinkled from rain that had seeped through the fabric for 3 straight weeks. He set the folder on the desk by the window, where the city lights spilled in bright enough to read, then opened it. The first page was a copy of a transfer agreement for 3 primary logistics routes belonging to the Moretti family: the Great Lakes port route, the Midwest warehouse route, and the interstate ground transport route, all signed over to a shell company Salvatore had never heard of. But he recognized the structure instantly, because it was the kind of cover only big family attorneys knew how to build. The second and third pages were wire instructions, 7 separate transfers, each for several $100,000, all flowing into the same account in the Cayman Islands, and the name on the receiving account wasn't Franco. It was an alias Salvatore knew well because it had appeared in negotiations where he'd sat at the same table. The alias of Don Angelo Caruso, the Caruso family boss, the man Chicago's Mafia called the mediator, because he always smiled when he put the knife in your back. But it was the last page that stole Salvatore's breath. A handwritten letter, not typed, written on lined paper as if the 2 men who wrote it were so confident no one would ever see it, and Salvatore recognized Franco's distinctive right slant beside Caruso's ornate signature. The letter laid out the entire plan. Step 1. Manufacture false evidence that Salvatore was secretly collaborating with the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico to move contraband through Moretti Logistics. Step 2. Leak the forged evidence to the Council of Chicago's 5 families to trigger a vote of removal. Step 3. Once Salvatore was toppled, Caruso would take over the entire logistics network under the guise of restoring order, and Franco would be granted the position of new capo of the Moretti Empire as a reward for loyalty. The final 2 lines of the letter, written in darker black ink than the rest as if they'd been added afterward, said that every obstacle had to be cleared before the spring conference, and the word obstacle was underlined twice. Salvatore finished reading, closed the folder, and set both hands flat on the desk, palms down, like a man holding the ground together so it wouldn't split beneath his feet. He didn't slam the desk. He didn't tear the paper. He didn't throw the whiskey glass at the wall the way movies did, because Salvatore Moretti never wasted energy on useless rage. He stored it, compressed it, turned it into fuel for actions calculated and precise down to the millimeter. He turned to Genevieve, and she saw his eyes had changed. No longer the cold patience of a few hours earlier, but something she could only describe as 2 pits of ice, deep and dark and completely bottomless. "She saved me," Salvatore said, not speaking to Genevieve so much as to himself, his voice like a bone breaking in a silent room. "A maid whose name I couldn't even remember accidentally held what my entire intelligence empire didn't catch, and my own uncle tortured her for it." Then he straightened, fastened his shirt cuffs with mechanical precision, stepped to the door, and called for Pietro in a voice no louder than normal but somehow carrying through the entire penthouse hallway. "Pietro, lock down the building. No one in and no one out until I say so. Recheck every staff member in the penthouse tonight. Anyone who's had contact with Franco in the last 3 weeks, I want their name. And call Agnes. Tell her to prepare my office for the meeting tomorrow afternoon. 1 guest, 1 glass of whiskey, and don't forget to place the chair across from my desk, 2 steps farther back than usual. I want him to see my face clearly when I ask each question." Pietro nodded and vanished. Salvatore stood in the doorway with his back to Genevieve and added one last sentence without turning around. "Go to sleep. No one will touch you tonight. And from now on, you don't need to run anymore." Then he stepped into the dark hallway, and Genevieve sat alone in the room, for the first time in 3 weeks not having to hold the backpack to sleep. But she still didn't dare let it go, because she didn't yet know whether a mafia boss's promise was any more reliable than the promises of the foster families who'd taken her in and then abandoned her for half her life. The first light of a Chicago morning poured through the penthouse glass wall when Genevieve opened her eyes, and in that fragile moment between sleep and waking, she didn't remember where she was. She only knew her back didn't ache from a stone bench. Her skin wasn't wet, and there was something warm in the air. The smell of porridge, the smell of melting butter, the smell of something she'd forgotten the name of, because for 3 weeks the only things she'd smelled were garbage and rain on cold concrete. She turned her head and saw, on the nightstand, arranged with the careful intention of someone who'd thought about the position of every item, a bowl of plain rice porridge still steaming with a silver spoon set at a 45-degree angle, a glass of fresh orange juice, and a brand new bottle of prenatal vitamins, an expensive pharmacy label, the cap still sealed, placed beside a small note in Agnes's rounded handwriting. "Take one every morning after breakfast, my girl." Genevieve stared at that note longer than she looked at anything else, because those 2 words, my girl, tightened her throat. No one had called her that since her mother burned to death in the house in Englewood 13 years earlier, and she had to bite hard into her lower lip so she wouldn't cry, because she'd decided a long time ago that tears were a luxury people without a home weren't allowed to waste. She ate slowly, not because she wanted to savor it, but because her stomach had shrunk after 3 weeks of near starvation, and she knew if she ate too fast she'd throw it all up. Then she put on the clothes Agnes had washed and dried overnight, and stepped out into the living room. Salvatore stood before the glass wall looking over the city, in the same spot where, by the crease in the carpet, she guessed he'd been standing for hours. The shirt from last night rumpled across his back, sleeves still rolled, unchanged, unshaven by sleep, and on the table beside him were 3 empty coffee cups and a clean ashtray. Because Salvatore Moretti didn't smoke but kept an ashtray there out of habit inherited from his father, the man who'd been shot to death in a restaurant on Taylor Street when Salvatore was 18. He heard her footsteps and turned, his eyes sweeping her from head to toe in a single second, not the way a man looked at a woman, but the way someone used to measuring damage looked at what had been broken, to calculate what it would take to fix it. "Sit," he said, pulling a chair away from the dining table with one hand. "Eat breakfast. I told Agnes to make more." Genevieve sat, and in front of her was a second breakfast she hadn't asked for. Scrambled eggs, toast, sliced fruit, and she had to fight the instinct to stuff it all into her clothes in case there wasn't another meal later, because 3 weeks on the street had taught her every meal could be the last. Salvatore sat across from her, didn't eat, only drank his 4th coffee, and while she ate, he asked in a voice as casual as weather but with eyes that never left her face, "Where did you grow up before you entered foster care?" Genevieve stopped chewing for a second, then answered with short, plain truth. No embellishment, no self-pity, because she'd told her story enough times to social workers to learn that pity didn't turn into a roof. She said Englewood, the south side of Chicago. Her father was a plumber, her mother a cashier at a grocery store. They borrowed money from the wrong people, and the house burned at 2 in the morning when she was 14. She survived because she'd slept at a classmate's house that night, and when she came back there was only ash and 2 fire trucks. Then the system, she said, using the word system the way other people said prison. 3 foster families in 4 years. The first one was fine until the foster father lost his job and started drinking. The second took foster kids for the stipend and fed her 1 meal a day. The third, she didn't describe beyond, saying I left on my own when I was 16. And the way she said it, fast and flat like reciting a phone number, told Salvatore whatever happened in that third house was something she'd never tell anyone. She said she earned her GED on her own, worked washing dishes, mopping floors, cleaning hotel rooms, and when she got hired at the Moretti mansion, it was the first time in her life she'd had her own room with a door that locked, and she said it as normally as she could, but her hand clenched tight along the table edge. Salvatore listened, silent for a moment, then asked the next question, and this one he asked softer than all the ones before. So soft it almost wasn't a question at all, just breath given shape. "Who's the baby's father?" The dining room froze. Genevieve didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the toast on her plate, and she didn't answer, but her hand released the table edge and slowly settled over her belly, an unconscious gesture, protective, shielding, the same gesture she'd made when she'd spoken about Franco the day before, and Salvatore saw it. He saw it clearly, the way her palm found her stomach whenever fear connected back to the same source. Silence stretched 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and every second was an answer. Then Genevieve said, her voice so thin it was almost gone, like a thread about to snap, "I don't want to talk about that." She didn't say, "I don't know." She didn't say there is no father. She didn't offer any lie she could have used to protect herself. She only said, "I don't want to talk," and that ruthless honesty told Salvatore more than any confession ever could. He set his coffee cup down on the table, gently, without a sound, and he looked at her. Really looked. Not at a maid, not at a witness, not at a victim, but at a human being sitting in front of him trying to keep her world from collapsing by clenching her hands beneath the table until her nails bit into her palms. He didn't say he understood. He didn't say he'd get revenge. He didn't promise anything. Because Salvatore Moretti never promised with words. He promised with action, and the only action he took in that moment was a single, slow nod. Then he rose, fastened his cuffs, and walked toward the study like a man who'd just been handed the final coordinates on a map he'd been piecing together all night. Genevieve remained at the table alone, and she didn't know that what had shifted in Salvatore's eyes as he walked away wasn't the anger she'd seen last night. It had evolved into something darker, colder, and far more deliberate, something the people who'd known Salvatore for years called by only one name, a sentence. Because when Salvatore Moretti stopped being angry, it meant he'd started planning. And when he started planning, there wasn't a god alive who could save the person standing on the other end. Franco arrived at the penthouse at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctual as always because he valued precision, or at least the appearance of precision, stepping out of the elevator in a dark gray suit, polished shoes, and the smile of a 58-year-old man who believed he'd won a game without anyone noticing. Salvatore, nephew. He called from the foyer, warm and familiar the way he'd sounded so many times before. The voice of the uncle who'd held Salvatore at his baptism, who'd stood beside his father's coffin and sworn he'd protect the family with his life. And Salvatore heard that voice from inside the study, feeling each familiar syllable fall like poison mixed into honey. Then he smiled. The kind of smile Pietro had seen exactly 3 times in his life, and all 3 times it ended with someone on the floor. "Come in, uncle," Salvatore said, rising from behind his desk with an easy, generous gesture, as if this were just a normal afternoon between 2 men of the same blood. Then he went to the liquor cabinet, took out a bottle of 30-year Macallan, poured 2 glasses, handed one to Franco, and kept one for himself. Franco accepted it, and sat in the chair across from the desk that Agnes had placed 2 steps farther back than usual on Salvatore's orders, and he didn't notice the strange distance, because he was busy sipping whiskey and talking about the southern logistics route, about a delayed shipment at the Milwaukee port, about the transport crew needing more men, numbers, and details he knew by heart, because it was the part of the empire he was secretly selling to Caruso. Salvatore listened, nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions, lifted his glass at the right times, and for the first 12 minutes, nothing seemed unusual except one detail Franco missed. Salvatore hadn't taken a single sip. The whiskey in his hand was still full. Then, right in the middle of Franco talking about rising fuel costs, Salvatore set his glass down, opened a drawer, and placed the manila folder on the oak surface between them. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The folder lay there like an unexploded bomb, the edges still wrinkled from rainwater, and Franco saw it, recognized it, because his eyes betrayed him before his mouth could react, his pupils widening for a fraction of a second, the same reflex a prey animal had when it caught the scent of a hunter. Then he tried to pull his face back under control, but it was too late, because Salvatore had read everything in that blink. Silence dropped into the room like an iron curtain. Franco set his whiskey down, his hand trembling slightly, a vibration he tried to hide by placing both hands on his thighs, and he began to speak, his tone shifting from intimate to defensive, so fast you could almost hear gears grinding into place. "Salvatore, you have to understand. Caruso forced me. He's got leverage on me from the time your father was still alive. I didn't have a choice. I did it all to protect the family, to protect you. If I didn't cooperate, then Caruso would strike head-on and we'd lose everything." Salvatore stayed still. No nod, no shake of the head, no frown, no change in posture. Just sitting there and looking at Franco with the eyes of a man watching an insect writhe beneath a magnifying glass. And that silence was more brutal than any punch, because it made Franco fill the void with more words, more lies, more rope to hang himself. Franco kept talking, his voice starting to crack, saying he'd planned to tell Salvatore when the timing was right, that he'd been playing both sides to gather information about Caruso from inside, that he was a spy, not a traitor. And each sentence came louder than the last, because Salvatore was still silent, still giving him nothing, and that silence crushed Franco slowly, like a hydraulic press flattening an aluminum can. When Franco ran out of excuses and started begging, his voice shifting from confidence into pleading, calling Salvatore by the childhood nickname, invoking his father, invoking blood, invoking the oath beside the coffin, Salvatore finally spoke. And what he said had nothing to do with logistics or Caruso or betrayal. It was only 6 words. Low, slow, and more dangerous than any gunshot. Did you touch her? Franco stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open, and for the first time in the conversation, he went completely silent. A silence unlike Salvatore's. This was the silence of a man caught in the act. Then he swallowed and spoke too quickly. I don't know what you're talking about. That girl was a thief. I only fired her by the book. I never touched her. Salvatore watched him for 3 more seconds, then pressed the intercom on his desk and said, Agnes, bring Miss Cole in. The study door opened, and Genevieve walked in, Agnes behind her like an invisible shield. Genevieve wore clean clothes Agnes had found for her, her copper-brown hair still damp because she'd taken her first real shower in 3 weeks, and she looked better than last night but still so thin her collarbones rose beneath the neckline like 2 blades. She took 2 steps into the room, then her eyes met Franco, and everything happened in less than a second. But Salvatore saw it all like slow-motion film. Her pupils blew wide, her face went from pale to paper white. Her body retreated a step before her brain could give the order, and both hands flew to her belly, clamping tight, protecting, the same gesture Salvatore had seen that morning at the dining table when he'd asked about the baby's father, and now she was doing it again, while staring straight at Franco. And that reaction spoke louder than any statement, louder than any document, because the body doesn't know how to lie. Her eyes widened in terror. Her lips moved without sound, and she stood there trembling in the middle of the room like a 14-year-old girl watching her house burn all over again. Franco looked at Genevieve, then looked at Salvatore, and he saw something in his nephew's eyes he hadn't seen in 37 years. Not rage, not contempt, but absolute certainty, cold and clean as a freshly honed blade, the certainty of a man who'd already passed sentence, and nothing on earth could change it. Salvatore nodded to Pietro at the door. What happened next was fast and exact, and without a single scream, because Salvatore didn't scream. He didn't need to. He only stood, walked around the desk, and when Franco tried to rise, Salvatore's hand drove his shoulder back into the chair with a strength Franco had forgotten his nephew possessed. Then Salvatore bent and spoke into his ear in a whisper only the 2 of them could hear, and even though no one else in the room knew what he said, Franco's face went from white to the gray of wet cement. Pietro and 2 more men stepped in and hauled Franco up, and as they dragged him through the door, Salvatore added one final line, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Keep him alive. I need his mouth for talking, but he doesn't need enough fingers to sign anything ever again. The door closed. The room fell silent again, and Genevieve still stood in the center, both hands locked over her belly, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the empty space where Franco had been sitting as if his ghost were still clinging to the leather chair. Salvatore stood in the middle of the study, staring at the door that had just closed behind Franco, and he stayed that way for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, until the sound of footsteps and the elevator vanished, until Franco's presence was erased from this space completely, and only then did he turn back to Genevieve. She was still standing in the center of the room, in the exact place she'd been when she saw Franco, as if her feet had grown roots into the marble, both hands still locked over her belly, and she was shaking, not from cold or simple fear, but from something deeper, from bone, from the place the body stores memories, the mind refuses to hold. Salvatore walked toward her, not with the fast step of an attacker, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a man approaching a wounded animal, and he stopped an arm's length away, close enough for her to see his eyes but far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered, and he didn't touch her, didn't place a hand on her shoulder, didn't hug her, didn't offer any comfort gesture he knew would be hollow, because Salvatore Moretti had never comforted anyone in his life, and he wasn't about to begin with a lie. He only said, his voice deep and steady as the building's foundation, "No one in this building will touch you again, not even me, unless you allow it." Genevieve looked up, her eyes still wet, not because she was crying, but because fear had wrung her so dry even her eyes couldn't hold their water. And she searched him for what she'd been searching for all night and all morning, the monster Franco had promised would kill her, but she couldn't find it. What she saw was a man who had just destroyed his own uncle for her, a man standing an arm's length away and keeping that distance like a vow. She nodded, a small nod, and then her legs buckled, and Agnes, somewhere behind her, caught her before she fell and guided her back to the living room. And that night Genevieve slept for 14 straight hours, the first sleep without nightmares since she'd been thrown into the street. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm. neither Salvatore nor Genevieve had expected. She recovered faster than Dr. Wakefield predicted, not by miracle, but because her body was used to rebuilding itself after being broken. 13 years in the foster care system and on the street had taught her bones and flesh how to heal with will instead of medicine. On the first day, she managed 3 small meals without vomiting. On the second day, she walked around the penthouse, her hand touching each surface without thinking, like a blind person drawing a map. On the third day, the maid's instinct woke before consciousness, and Salvatore walked into the study at 7 in the morning to find her dusting the bookshelf with a cloth she'd taken from the laundry room, spine straight, movements precise, as if 6 months at the mansion had carved a sequence into her muscles that even 3 weeks on the street couldn't erase. "What are you doing?" Salvatore asked from the doorway, not angry, but with something she hadn't heard from him before, almost confusion. Genevieve turned, the cloth still in her hand, and said as normally as she could, "I'm cleaning the shelves. There's dust in the upper right corner from the day I arrived. I couldn't sleep, so I cleaned." Salvatore stepped into the room, took the cloth from her hand, not yanking it, but drawing it out gently the way you pulled a handkerchief from a vest pocket, and set it on the desk. "You're not a maid here anymore," he said, and the sentence carried the weight of an order but was spoken like a man trying to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. Genevieve looked at him and asked the question he didn't have an answer for. "Then what am I?" Salvatore opened his mouth, closed it, looked out the window where Chicago was waking under rare winter sun, and said nothing. Because he was a man who had answers for everything, who knew the value of every shipping lane, who knew the names of every captain's wife and children, who knew exactly how much pressure it took to squeeze the trigger of a Beretta, but he didn't know what the 27-year-old girl standing in his study with book dust on her fingers was in his life, and that not knowing unsettled him more than any threat from Caruso. That night, close to 2 in the morning, Salvatore sat in the study with only the desk lamp lit, logistics network maps spread in front of him, a list of captains Franco had named as Caruso's bought men, and he was calculating how many loyal soldiers he still had when he heard soft footsteps in the hall. Genevieve stood in the study doorway wearing the pajamas Agnes had given her, copper-brown hair loose over her shoulders, shadows under her eyes from nightmares. "I can't sleep," she said. No apology, no extra explanation, only the truth. "Neither can I," Salvatore said, and he didn't know why he did the next thing, but he nodded toward the armchair across from the desk, and she walked in and sat, drawing her legs up, hugging a pillow, and they sat in silence for a while. Not heavy silence, but strangely comfortable. The silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill empty space, because both had lived in empty space their whole lives. Then Genevieve asked, her voice small but direct, steady, no hesitation. "Why did you really save me? And don't say because I'm yours, because I'm not anyone's. I've never been anyone's." Salvatore looked at her in the desk lamp light, half her face bright, half in shadow. And he told the truth, because 3 in the morning was the hour when even professional liars got tired enough to be honest. "At first it was curiosity. I recognized your hair and wanted to know why one of my employees was lying in the rain. Then when I saw the burns on your wrists, it was anger that someone had crossed into my territory without permission. But now," he paused, looked down at the map, then back at her. "Now I don't know, and I hate not knowing." Genevieve watched him and said, not angry, but certain as steel, "I don't want to be anyone's territory. I was the foster care system's territory for 14 years, territory of foster families who wanted the stipend, territory of Franco for 2 days in that cement room. I don't want to be territory anymore. For anyone, not even you." Salvatore looked at her, and he wasn't angry, and that was what shocked him most, because no one had spoken to his face like that since his father died and everyone started fearing him. But the thin girl curled in the armchair in his study at 3 in the morning had just told him she didn't belong to him, and instead of rage he felt something he didn't have a name for. Something like respect, but warmer, more dangerous. They sat in silence a while longer. Then Genevieve yawned and tried to hide it behind her hand, but failed. And Salvatore saw, and somehow he lifted his hand and smoothed the copper-brown strand that had fallen across her forehead, his fingers touching her skin for a single second, lighter than the way he touched a trigger. And Genevieve held her breath. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch, didn't panic. She only sat there holding her breath and looking at him with eyes that, in the lamplight, looked like wet amber. Then Salvatore pulled his hand back fast, as if he'd touched fire, and he stood, fastening his cuffs even though they were already fastened. A useless gesture she recognized as him being awkward for the first time since she'd met him. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice lower than usual. Not an order, but almost a request. "Tomorrow will be long." Genevieve rose, walked to the door, paused on the threshold for one more second without turning back, then left, her footsteps fading down the hall until Salvatore sat alone again in the study, staring at the armchair where she'd been, and he realized that for the first time in 37 years, this room felt emptier after someone walked out. Franco confessed everything on the morning of the 4th day, not because he'd found the courage to atone, but because Pietro had a way of asking questions that made people want to answer, and what Franco gave up turned the picture from bad into catastrophic. Salvatore sat in the study listening as Pietro read the recorded statement back through an encrypted phone line, and every name that came out of the speaker landed like a hammer. 4 of his 6 captains had been bought by Caruso. Not 4 newcomers, not 4 fringe opportunists, but 4 pillars. Mancini in charge of the Great Lakes route, Horowitz running the Midwest warehouses, Delgado controlling the interstate ground lines, and Brennan, not Agnes but her nephew, Kieran Brennan, the head of security with master key access to every Moretti property, the man who'd opened the door for Franco's 2 men to take Genevieve in broad daylight, with no camera footage because he'd been the one to shut the system down. Caruso paid each of them a sum large enough to erase 20 years of loyalty, and in return they would stand up in the Council of Chicago's 5 families and testify that Salvatore was secretly working with the Sinaloa cartel. The forged evidence already built, fake contracts, fake photos, even an edited audio recording stitched from Salvatore's real phone calls, convincing enough to remove him by vote without firing a single bullet. Franco had been promised the position of new capo of the Moretti Empire, a puppet on the throne while Caruso pulled the strings from behind, and he'd agreed because he'd spent 37 years living in his brother's shadow and then his nephew's, and he wanted, just once, to stand in sunlight even if that sunlight was fake. Salvatore set the phone down and looked at the list of names he still trusted on the desk, and the list was so short he could count it on one hand. Pietro, still recovering from an old shoulder wound but ready to die for him at any moment. Agnes, who knew every corner of the mansion and the penthouse. Dr. Wakefield, keeper of medical secrets, and the 2 remaining loyal captains from his father's time. Men too old to fight but too loyal to betray. That was it. An empire worth hundreds of millions, and he had exactly 6 people he could trust. 7 if he counted the former maid who was 7 weeks pregnant and sleeping in the living room. He called a meeting in the study with Pietro and the 3 old men. The door pulled shut but not latched because the old hinge never caught cleanly, and he began to break down the situation. The paper evidence in the manila folder could be dismissed by Caruso as fabrication. Signatures could be denied. Transfer contracts could be called drafts never finalized. In short, the folder was a gun, without bullets, and in the world of the 5-family council where Don Caruso's word weighed more than paper, Salvatore needed something that couldn't be argued away, something digital with timestamps and metadata no lawyer could erase. The meeting was sliding toward a dead end when the study door opened and Genevieve stood there. Copper-brown hair tied neatly at the nape, eyes clearer than they'd been at any point since she'd arrived at the penthouse, and she spoke without asking permission, stating it like fact. "Franco has a second phone." Every man in the room turned to look at her. Pietro's hand went to his hip where his gun sat by reflex and then dropped when he realized who it was. And Salvatore didn't speak. He only tilted his head by a single degree, a gesture she'd learned in 6 months at the mansion that meant, keep talking. Genevieve stepped inside and stopped at the edge of the table, and she told them that in 6 months of cleaning Franco's office, she'd watched enough to know his habits better than he knew his own, because that was how she survived, by becoming invisible and remembering everything. She said Franco always carried 2 phones, a normal iPhone for family business, and a smaller black phone with no brand name, the one he hid in the 3rd drawer on the left of his desk, a drawer with a lock that had been broken since March, because he'd yanked it too hard and bent the internal hinge. She knew because she cleaned that drawer every week, and could feel the lock wasn't catching even though Franco believed it still worked. She said that phone was the one he held whenever he told her to leave and shut the door, and he always put it back in the drawer before letting her come in to keep cleaning. And if that phone held messages and calls with Caruso, then it was the digital proof Salvatore needed. But there was a problem, she said, her voice not hesitant but straight as a blade, like someone who'd weighed the cost before speaking. The mansion was now under Caruso control. Kieran Brennan and the new security team were watching every entrance. No one in that room could step inside without being spotted. No one except her, because she knew every door, every hall, every camera blind spot in that mansion. She said, "I propose we break in." The room went silent. Pietro looked at Salvatore. The three old men glanced at each other, and Salvatore looked at Genevieve, at the thin 27-year-old woman, 7 weeks pregnant, volunteering to walk straight back into the wolf's den, into the place she'd been tortured, and he searched her eyes for recklessness, panic, a need to prove herself, but what he saw was only the cold calculation of someone who'd survived long enough on the street to know that sometimes the safest way out of danger was to run straight into it. He didn't say he was impressed. He didn't thank her. He didn't show anything of what was moving behind his eyes, because Salvatore Moretti never let anyone see the map of his mind. He only nodded once, slow, and said, "Sit down, and tell me the mansion's security system. Every camera, every lock, every shift." And Genevieve pulled out a chair and joined the table among the most dangerous men in Chicago, as if she'd been sitting there her whole life. At midnight, on the third basement level of the penthouse, Salvatore pushed aside a steel panel behind the backup generator room and revealed a passage even Pietro had never seen in 20 years of serving the Moretti family. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, red brick walls laid back in Prohibition days in the 20s, when Salvatore's grandfather used it to move bootleg liquor from the Chicago River docks to the mansion without ever touching a street. The ceiling so low Salvatore had to duck, the smell of damp and clay catching in the lungs from the first step, and the flashlight beam the only light cutting through the thick darkness ahead. The 3 of them moved in silence, Pietro in front with his gun drawn, Salvatore in the middle holding a hand-drawn map his father had left in a private safe. Only Salvatore knew the code to, and Genevieve at the rear, her footsteps the lightest of the 3, because she'd learned to move without sound after 13 years of surviving by being invisible. Before they left, Salvatore tried one last time to convince her to stay. Not with an order, but with reason. Pietro could find the drawer if she described it precisely. Genevieve shook her head and said, "Franco changed the placement of objects in his office every week out of paranoid habit. The 3rd drawer on the left this week could be the 2nd drawer on the right next week, and she was the only one who understood that rotation, because she'd cleaned that room 180 times in 6 months, each time memorizing the smallest changes, not out of curiosity, but because it was how she made sure she never put anything back in the wrong place, and got yelled at." Salvatore looked at her, then nodded, because he understood arguing with that logic would be as useless as arguing with gravity. The tunnel ran nearly 2 kilometers beneath Chicago, turned 4 times, passed under 2 major streets, and a stretch of the Chicago River, and ended at a brick wall with a rusted iron door in the mansion's wine cellar. Pietro opened it with the key Salvatore handed him, the hinge giving a soft squeal, and they stepped into the mansion basement darkness where the smell of old wine and oak soaked everything. From there, Genevieve led, because she knew the mansion the way she knew her own palm. Every stair, every corner, every floorboard that creaked, details she'd memorized to avoid during early morning cleaning when the house was still asleep. They went up the back service stairs behind the kitchen, through the staff corridor, up to the 2nd floor, and with every step Genevieve placed her feet exactly where she knew no sound would carry, guiding 2 men nearly twice her size through the mansion like 3 shadows. But when they reached the hall leading to Franco's office, Genevieve stopped, and Salvatore saw her spine go rigid, her shoulders draw up, her hands begin to shake, because on the right side of the hall was the oak door to the room where Franco had ordered her blindfolded. And even though the torture room itself had been elsewhere, that door was the last thing she'd seen before the world sank into darkness and pain, and her body remembered before her mind could take control. She stood there for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and Salvatore didn't speak, didn't rush her, didn't touch her. He only waited behind her, because he understood there were battles no one else could fight for you. Then Genevieve took a short breath, clenched her hands, and moved forward, past that door without looking at it. And Salvatore saw in the dark that her fists were so tight her whole arm trembled, yet her steps didn't drift a millimeter. Franco's office wasn't locked because Kieran Brennan and the new security team didn't consider an empty room a priority. Genevieve stepped inside, swept the flashlight once, and went straight to the desk. Not the 3rd drawer on the left, but the 2nd on the right. Just as she'd predicted, Franco had rotated it before he was taken. She pulled it open, the broken lock giving way easily. And there, under a stack of old papers, the unmarked black phone lay with its screen dark, its battery nearly dead but still alive. She slid it into her jacket pocket, and the three of them retreated the way they'd come. They were nearing the basement stairs when heavy footsteps hit the wooden floor ahead, someone on night patrol, and a flashlight beam washed across the hall, moving toward them. Pietro lifted his gun, but Salvatore shook his head, because a gunshot inside the mansion at midnight would wake the entire security team, and in 1 second he scanned for an exit and pulled Genevieve into the nearest darkest room, a linen storage closet at the end of the hall, dragged her inside, pressed her back to the wall between shelves of folded sheets and old drapes, his left hand covering her mouth gently but firmly, his body shielding her completely, and Pietro slid into the darkness at the opposite corner and vanished like he'd never existed. The dark was so thick Genevieve couldn't see anything, only feel it. Her back against cold plaster, his chest pressed to hers, his breath hot across her forehead, the scent of sandalwood and faint gunpowder rising from his collar, and her heart going wild not only from fear of being caught, but from something else. Something she hated herself for feeling in that instant. Safety, the cruel contradiction that she was being held to a wall by a Mafia boss in the dark, and this was the first time in weeks she'd felt like no one could touch her. The footsteps passed, slow, heavy, then faded, then died away. Pietro whispered safe. But Salvatore didn't let her go immediately, and Genevieve didn't shove him away immediately, and they stayed there a few more seconds. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, longer than necessary, longer than safe. In a darkness where no one could see anyone, only breath and heartbeat, and the space between two bodies narrowing until it almost didn't exist. Then Salvatore stepped back, fast, decisive, like a man pulling himself away from a cliff edge, and he said, "Let's go in," a voice 2 notches lower than usual. They withdrew through the tunnel and returned to the penthouse near 3 in the morning, and Pietro went to check the building security, leaving Salvatore and Genevieve standing in the foyer, both of them slick with cold sweat and dusted with brick grit from the tunnel. Genevieve stood there with her hand still clenched around the phone in her pocket. And then without warning she cried, not sobbing, not wailing, but the kind of fierce, silent crying where tears stream down your face and not a sound escapes. Because Genevieve Cole had learned how to cry without noise at 14 in the first foster home where loud crying meant punishment. Salvatore watched her and didn't understand, because they'd succeeded. The phone was in their possession. No one was hurt. The mission was done. Why was she crying now? Then he understood, not through logic but through something deeper he hadn't known he still possessed. She was crying because for the first time in her life she'd walked into danger by her own choice, instead of being dragged into it. For the first time she'd fought instead of fled. For the first time she'd been the actor, and not the victim. And the feeling was too big for her body to hold, so it spilled out as tears. Salvatore stood beside her, and he didn't know what to do, because no one had taught him how to stand next to a woman who was crying without giving an order or fixing it or destroying the source of pain, so he did the only thing instinct offered. He set his hand on her shoulder, awkward, heavy, a hand used to guns more than people, and she turned and pressed her face to his chest, her forehead against his sternum, her tears soaking through his shirt, and Salvatore stood rigid as stone, his whole body not knowing how to react, because the last time anyone hugged him was his mother, and she died when he was 6. Then slowly, so slowly it was almost invisible, he lifted his other hand and placed it on her back. Not patting, not rubbing, only resting there, heavy and warm. And they stood like that in the penthouse foyer at 3 in the morning, the 2 loneliest people in Chicago finding each other in the smell of brick dust and cold sweat, and neither of them named what was happening because both were afraid that if they named it, it would disappear. The next morning, the unmarked black phone lay on the study desk, connected to Voss's laptop, the oldest tech specialist among the 3 loyal old men, a 62-year-old who'd once worked for the NSA before Salvatore's father pulled him in with triple pay, and a promise he'd never have to answer an FBI question again. Voss took 40 minutes to crack the screen passcode, another 20 to break the encrypted messaging app Franco used, and when the data began to populate the screen, Voss pushed the laptop toward Salvatore and backed out of the room without a word, because he'd lived long enough in this world to know exactly when to disappear. Salvatore sat down and read. The first message had been sent 4 months earlier, from Franco to a number with no saved name, but an Upper East Side area code, short and clean. Meet tonight. Rosario Restaurant. Back table. Come alone. From there, the conversation stretched into hundreds of messages, dense and detailed, laying out every step of the betrayal the manila folder had only captured on paper as a draft. While this was the real version, time-stamped, GPS tagged with send locations, stuffed with photos of forged documents in progress. And most importantly, the real voices of both men, with no disguise at all because they believed this phone would never land in anyone's hands. Caruso wrote that the Council of Chicago's 5 families would convene an emergency meeting at the Lyric Opera House tomorrow night, a meeting he'd been lobbying for 2 full weeks, officially to discuss shared security, but in truth, as the stage for the final act. Caruso would announce Salvatore Moretti had been discovered betraying the council, present the fabricated evidence, call for a vote of removal, and with 4 of Salvatore's captains standing to testify, the outcome would be decided before a ballot ever left a hand. But the most recent message, sent right before Franco was summoned to the penthouse, added a line cold enough to raise the hair on skin. If S. refuses to relinquish power, switch to Plan B. Physical liquidation. Hennessy will handle it. And the words physical liquidation sat there naked on the screen like a bullet already chambered. Salvatore read it all at a steady pace, his face unchanged, like he was reviewing a financial report instead of his own death sentence, until he scrolled to the thread from 3 weeks earlier, the same week Genevieve had been taken, and what he read there made everything before it feel small. Franco wrote to Caruso in language Salvatore had to read twice, because the first time his brain refused to process it, degrading words, filthy and humiliating, talking about Genevieve like an object, a disposable byproduct he'd used and thrown away. And buried inside that trash was one sentence that made the air in the room thicken like wet cement. The girl's been handled. She won't be able to say anything. And anyway, no one believes an orphaned maid. Salvatore read that line, and his right hand, the hand holding a pen he didn't remember picking up, tightened, and the pen snapped in two with a small crack he didn't hear, didn't notice, didn't look down, didn't register the blue ink seeping between his fingers like counterfeit blood, because his eyes stayed locked on the screen, and what was happening inside him had no sound, no outward expression. It was like a nuclear reactor, reaching critical mass, perfectly silent right before everything is destroyed. Genevieve stood in the corner of the room. She'd been there since Voss began decoding because Salvatore hadn't asked her to leave, and she understood this was evidence she'd risked her life to retrieve, so she had the right to know what it contained. She couldn't read the screen from that distance, but she didn't need to, because she saw the broken pen in his hand, saw the blue ink running along his fingers without him noticing, saw his jaw clenched so hard the tendons in his neck stood out like rope, and she knew he'd reached that part. The part she'd tried to hide. The part her silence yesterday at breakfast when he asked about the baby's father had almost confessed, except she hadn't been brave enough to turn it into words. The room went quiet. Salvatore closed the laptop, slow, every movement mechanical, then looked down at his hand, saw the ink and the snapped pen, and set them on the desk with the extreme control of a man using every cell in his body not to stand, drive to where Franco was being held, and end him with his bare hands. He lifted his gaze to Genevieve and she met it, and between them was 5 meters of space that weighed more than distance ever should, because it was filled with what they both knew and had never said out loud. "Now you know?" Genevieve said, her voice flat, not shaking, not breaking, flat as lake water that had been frozen so long it forgot how to ripple. And then she added, "I don't want pity. I don't need you to take revenge for me. I just need you to know the truth so you can use it the right way." Salvatore looked at her, and he didn't say he was sorry, because sorry would be hollow. He didn't say he'd kill Franco because she'd said she didn't need revenge. He didn't say anything a normal man would say, because he wasn't a normal man, and she didn't need normal words. He said, his voice deep and solid as the stone under the building's feet, "The baby will carry the Moretti name." Genevieve stared at him. And for the first time since he'd found her outside the bus station, she didn't understand, because that sentence wasn't in any script she'd prepared in her mind. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a promise of vengeance. It wasn't pity. It was something she didn't have language for. He continued, "No one will touch your child again, not because you're mine or my territory, but because that baby will be a Moretti, and this world can burn to ash, but no one touches a Moretti child and lives to tell the story." Genevieve stood against the wall with her arms at her sides, and she didn't cry. She'd cried enough the night before in the penthouse foyer with her face pressed to his chest. But now, something else happened. A single tear fell down her left cheek and dropped from her chin, and she didn't wipe it away, didn't hide it, didn't feel ashamed, because that tear wasn't pain. It was something she'd forgotten how to feel since she was 14, and watched the Englewood house burn, and knew no one in the world would call her name in the morning again. It was hope, small and fragile and terrifying, because she knew hope could be ripped away at any moment. But it was there, in the words of a Mafia boss who had just declared that the unborn child inside her, the child she'd treated like a scar, would have a name, a family line, a place to belong, the thing she herself had never had. Caruso didn't wait for the conference. The last message on Franco's phone spelled out Plan B, physical liquidation. Hennessy will handle it, but Salvatore misjudged the timing, because he assumed Caruso would wait until after the Lyric Opera House meeting to strike, to make it look legitimate in front of the council. And he forgot Caruso was the kind of snake that bit before it warned you, and that mistake nearly killed him. That night, at 11:43, Salvatore was in the study with his laptop open, planning the counterstrike for the Lyric Opera House meeting. Genevieve asleep in the living room, Agnes in her downstairs room, Pietro on watch in the foyer, and the 3 old loyal men rotating shifts on the ground level. When the camera system on the service corridor went black, Pietro knew instantly it wasn't a signal drop. It was a cut, clean and professional, the kind of cut made by someone who knew exactly which wire to sever, and he drew his gun, turning toward the service elevator door, managing to shout "boss" before the steel door burst open and everything turned into hell. Boyd Hennessy stepped out first, 42, shaved head, eyes empty with the calm of a professional predator, a suppressed pistol in his right hand already ready, followed by 3 more men in black moving in a fan formation, fast, silent, lethal. Hennessy's first shot was aimed at Pietro, but Pietro pivoted, not to dodge, to shield. Because between Hennessy and the study door where Salvatore sat there was only Pietro's body, and the bullet went through Pietro's left shoulder, through the trapezius, missing the shoulder blade. And he hit the marble floor but kept his gun in hand and fired back twice, dropping one of the black-clad men before Hennessy's third shot punched through Pietro's thigh, and Pietro flattened out, blood spreading across the white stone. Salvatore heard the shots, flipped his desk into cover in less than a second, pulled his Beretta from the hidden compartment under the desktop, and lunged for the study door, but the second black-clad man was already there, and a round grazed Salvatore's left thigh like a red-hot blade carving a line down his quadriceps. He dropped to one knee, returned fire and put 2 rounds into that man's chest. Then his leg gave out completely, and he went down hard, back against the hallway wall, blood soaking through his left pant leg. And Hennessy was walking toward the end of the hall with steady steps, not rushing, because a professional assassin didn't need to rush when the prey was wounded and on the floor. Genevieve heard gunfire from the living room, and woke the way 3 weeks on the streets of Chicago had trained her to wake. Silent, fast, low. She rolled off the bed, flattened to the floor, listened, counted the shots, found the direction, then crawled to the doorway and looked out into the hall. She saw Pietro on the marble, blood pooling around him, his hand still wrapped around his gun but no strength left to lift it. She saw Salvatore farther down the corridor, slumped against the wall, one hand clamped over his bleeding thigh, the other holding his weapon, but Hennessy was coming from a blind angle Salvatore couldn't cover, and in 1 second, she understood that if she did nothing, Salvatore would be dead in 5 seconds. "Run," Salvatore shouted when he saw her in the living room doorway. His voice, pure command. The voice no one in the Moretti Empire ever disobeyed. "The fire exit is in the kitchen. Go now. Don't look back." Genevieve didn't run. She crawled to Pietro, fast and low, her knees sliding through his warm blood on the marble, and she pulled the gun from his hand, heavier than she expected, heavier than anything she'd ever held, and her hands shook because she'd never touched a gun before tonight. The second Foster family had guns, but she wasn't allowed near them, and she didn't want to be. But now she wrapped both hands around the grip and dropped behind the marble column in the foyer, dragged in one breath, and fired. The first shot punched the ceiling, plaster raining down like white dust. The second snapped into the wall to Hennessy's right by about 1/2 meter. The third came closer, grazing his shoulder line, and Hennessy had to stop and turn toward her, because even if all 3 missed, no assassin kept walking forward when fire came from the flank, and the 3 seconds he lost identifying the new threat were the 3 seconds Salvatore needed. Salvatore lifted the Beretta in his right hand, his left pressing hard into his thigh to slow the bleeding, his eyes locking onto Hennessy through gun smoke and falling plaster, and he fired one shot, only one, because Salvatore Moretti never needed a second. The bullet went straight into the center of Hennessy's forehead, and the assassin folded to the floor like poured concrete with its supports cut. The last man in Hennessy's team swung his weapon toward Genevieve, but one of the old loyal men from downstairs came up the stairs at a run and dropped him with 2 shots from behind before he could squeeze the trigger. Silence fell. The thick silence after gunfire, when ears still rang and the smell of powder clung to everything and the air tasted metallic with blood. Salvatore lay against the wall with his left thigh drenched, and he looked up. Genevieve stood behind the column with both hands still locked around the gun, the barrel angled down, her shoulders shaking so hard her whole arms trembled, her knees streaked with Pietro's blood, copper-brown hair loose across her face, her eyes bright with tears that didn't fall because she was holding them back with sheer will, the same will that had kept her alive through 3 weeks on the street and 13 years in the foster system. And she stood there in smoke and bodies, 27, thin, 7 weeks pregnant. The orphaned maid Franco had called already handled, standing with a gun in her hands after saving the life of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. Salvatore looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as the former maid, not as the victim, not as the witness, but as something he hadn't expected to exist in his world, a person who would stand in the line of fire for him, not for money, not for fear, not for orders, but for a reason neither of them had dared to name. And under the hallway, lights flickering because a bullet had shattered a fixture, her eyes met his through the smoke, and neither of them spoke, because there were moments when language became useless under the weight of what had just happened. Everything happened in the 15 minutes after the last gunshot. Fast and precise, because Salvatore gave orders even while bleeding out on the floor. And that was what had kept him alive in this world for so long, the ability to think the clearest when everything was on fire. Dr. Wakefield arrived in 9 minutes. He didn't ask what happened, because the 4 bodies on the marble said enough. He dropped to his knees beside Pietro first, because Pietro was losing blood the fastest. 2 rounds, left shoulder and thigh, and he spoke to Salvatore in the voice of a man who no longer had time for politeness. He needs surgery within an hour or he dies. I've got someone at Mercy Hospital, but we can't take him through the front entrance. We need the back door to the ER, and we need someone inside to erase the admission record. Do it, Salvatore said, and Wakefield and 2 of the old loyal men lifted Pietro into the elevator, blood dripping on the marble and drawing a red line from the foyer to the doors. And when the elevator closed, Salvatore knew the penthouse was dead. Caruso knew the address, knew the security layout, knew every entry point, and the next team would come before dawn, maybe larger, maybe with explosives. He tried to stand, his left leg refusing to take weight, the grazed round in his thigh not through the muscle but tearing skin and quadriceps deep enough that each step was a white flash of pain, and Genevieve was there. She'd set the gun down the second the shooting stopped, because her hands were shaking too hard to hold it. But now she slid her shoulder under his arm and hauled him up, her small frame taking his weight without breaking, and he looked down at her, startled because she was stronger than her thin body looked. Then he remembered she'd survived 13 years of foster care and 3 weeks on the streets of Chicago. Of course she was strong, the kind of strong that didn't come from muscle. It came from spine. They took the elevator down to the parking basement, where an old 1996 Ford truck sat waiting, paint peeling gray, fake plates, a backup vehicle Salvatore's father had left for the day everything collapsed, and it turned out the old man had been right to prepare for the apocalypse, because the apocalypse had arrived. The key was in a magnetic box under the chassis. Genevieve found it before Salvatore did, because she was shorter and didn't have to bend as far. She opened the driver's door and Salvatore looked at her. "You can drive." She nodded. "I got my license at 18. One of the foster families had an old truck I drove to pick up groceries every week. I can drive." Salvatore lowered himself into the passenger seat, swallowing a groan when his left thigh hit the door frame, and Genevieve took the wheel, adjusted the rearview mirror, checked the fuel, put it in gear, all with a calm so controlled. It was frightening for a woman who'd fired a gun for the first time in her life, 15 minutes earlier. Then she drove the truck out of the garage into the Chicago night, with the headlights off until they cleared the alley behind the building, then switched them on and merged onto the Dan Ryan Expressway, heading south toward Gary, Indiana. Salvatore sat in the passenger seat with his left hand pressing a towel Agnes had shoved at him before she stayed behind to clean the scene against the thigh wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain still throbbed to his heartbeat, and the world began to drift at the edges of his vision as blood loss softened everything into blur. He pulled a burner phone from the emergency box under the seat, a phone he'd hidden there 5 years ago for the worst-case scenario and never thought he'd have to use. Then he dialed a number, his fingers still remembered even though his mind had tried to forget it. It rang 4 times. A low, rough voice answered, the voice of a man yanked from sleep and angry about it. "Who is this?" "Tommaso," Salvatore said, and the name alone made him swallow something bitter in his throat, because the last time he'd spoken, it was 5 years ago, when he'd told his younger brother to leave the Moretti Empire and never come back, and Tommaso had listened, vanishing into a scrapyard in Gary like he'd never existed. Silence on the other end. 3 seconds, 4, then a dry laugh with nothing joyful in it. "Oh, big brother, I thought you were dead. I was going to open champagne." "I need shelter," Salvatore said, forcing his pride down with the metallic taste in his mouth. "And I need a doctor." Tommaso laughed again, more bitter. "If you come here, I might finish what the assassin started with my own hands." "I've got a woman with me," Salvatore said, "and she's carrying the future of the Moretti line." The line went quiet. Not the mocking quiet, not the bitter quiet, the kind of quiet that meant a man was processing information he hadn't expected. Because even if Tommaso had walked away, he was still a Moretti, blood was still blood, and the future of the line weighed more than 5 years of rage. "Bring her," Tommaso said, his voice dropping an octave. "But if you bring trouble to my door, I'll kill you myself." Salvatore ended the call, let his head fall back against the seat, eyes closing, and for a moment, Genevieve thought he'd blacked out until he spoke, low and slightly blurred from blood loss. "You saved my life." Genevieve kept her eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel, knuckles white in the highway lights. "We're even," she said, calm but trembling on the last word. "No," Salvatore said, still with his eyes closed. "You disobeyed me. I told you to run. You didn't run." Genevieve felt her gut clamp, because she knew in his world disobedience could mean a death sentence, and she tightened her grip on the wheel and waited, heart hammering harder than it had when she fired the gun. "Good," Salvatore said, and she almost hit the brake by mistake, because good was the last word she expected. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and in the strobing glow of the highway lights through the windshield, his gaze was sharper than she expected for a man losing blood. "I don't need a maid, Genevieve. I don't need a witness. I don't need someone to protect. I need a partner. And tonight you proved you're the only person in this world I can trust. Because you could have run, and you didn't run. And in 37 years of living, I've never met anyone who did that for me without money or fear." Genevieve didn't answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because her throat tightened, and she kept her eyes on the road, driving the old truck through the night toward Gary, Indiana, where a discarded brother waited in a fortress of steel and rust. And she thought maybe this was the first time in her life anyone had called her by a word that wasn't victim, wasn't orphan, wasn't maid, but partner, and that word weighed more than she'd expected. So heavy she had to bite her lip to keep from crying on the expressway, because she was driving and the lives of 3 people depended on her hands, and she didn't have the luxury of tears, not yet. The scrapyard rose out of the night like a sleeping iron monster in the industrial wasteland of Gary, Indiana. Thousands of crushed car bodies stacked into metal walls higher than a 3-story building, dull yellow halogen lights on rusted steel poles sweeping the yard like prison floodlights, and Genevieve drove the old truck through a steel gate, already standing open, as if someone had been watching them on cameras from the moment they turned off the highway. She parked inside the main bay, a huge hangar blazing under fluorescent lights, where dozens of men with wrenches and welding torches looked up at the truck with the eyes of people who measured threat before they measured humanity. Then an upstairs door swung open, and Tommaso Moretti came down a metal staircase, and Genevieve understood instantly why Salvatore called him the family's black sheep. Because if Salvatore was a scalpel, Tommaso was a sledgehammer. 33, taller than his brother by half a head, shoulders 1.5 times as wide, a thick black beard covering half his face, hands so greasy they looked like permanent black gloves, wearing a dirty gray tee and work overalls, the complete opposite of Salvatore's armored refinement. But the eyes were the same black, the same split-second appraisal of everything, And Genevieve realized the brothers were different on the surface, but made of the same material underneath, the same steel, forged by two different fires. "You look like trash, Tommaso said, stopping 2 meters from the truck, folding arms as thick as a man's thigh across his chest, eyes sweeping the blood on Salvatore's pants and the pallor of his face, his voice rough. But there was something beneath it Genevieve caught at once, because she'd lived too long around people who hid emotion behind cruelty, worry. Salvatore opened the passenger door and tried to step down, but his left leg wouldn't take him and he staggered. Genevieve ran around from the driver's side and got under his arm before Tommaso could move. And in that moment, when Tommaso saw the thin 27-year-old maid bracing his brother's body with her own, her small hand locked on Salvatore's belt, and he looked down at her belly, not showing yet but protected in the way she moved, the way she automatically angled herself to shield her lower body. He understood, and his posture changed, not snapping like a switch, rising like a tide, the mockery draining away, and something older taking its place. Something both Moretti brothers inherited from their father, even if they never admitted it. The instinct to protect the bloodline. He stepped in without a word, took Salvatore from the other side, and for the first time in 5 years the brothers stood together, held each other up, even if neither of them would call it that. Doctor. Wakefield arrived 40 minutes later. How and from where Genevieve didn't ask, because in this world there were questions you were safer not knowing, and he treated Salvatore's thigh on a steel table in the upstairs office. 12 stitches, antibiotics, a bag of fluids. And through all of it, Genevieve sat on a folding chair beside the table and didn't move. Tommaso told her to rest in the next room. Wakefield told her she needed sleep because the fetus needed rest. She only shook her head and stayed, her hand on the table edge a few centimeters from Salvatore's, not touching but close enough for both of them to know the other was there. And Salvatore didn't tell her to go, because he'd stopped giving her orders the moment she disobeyed him in the penthouse. He understood Genevieve Cole wasn't the kind of person who took commands. She was the kind of person who chose to stay. When Wakefield finished and left, Tommaso led them into a soundproof room upstairs, a steel-lined space with a thick door he used when he needed to say things the walls shouldn't hear. And there, on a scarred metal table, Genevieve placed Franco's unmarked black phone, the phone she'd risked everything to pull from the mansion, and Salvatore set the laptop beside it with the fully decrypted data. Then he said, "Caruso is meeting the council at the Lyric Opera House tomorrow night. He's going to announce I'm dead and take the Moretti Empire. We've got less than 24 hours. Tommaso read the messages on the screen, his face darkening line by line. And when he finished, he said, "So what's the plan?" Salvatore pointed to a map of the Lyric Opera House Voss had downloaded. "We go straight in. While Caruso's performing his little show, we put every piece of evidence on the screen in front of the council. By the old rules, a summit is neutral ground, and nobody's allowed to strike there. If we can walk in, we stay alive long enough to speak. But you need someone to stand up and present it," Tommaso said. "You're the accused in their eyes. Your words won't carry. You need a witness." "I'll go," Genevieve said, her voice cutting through the room like a thin blade. And both Moretti brothers turned toward her, Tommaso with shock and Salvatore with something close to acceptance, as if he'd stopped being surprised by her the moment she fired at Hennessy. "I'm the witness," she said. "I'm the one who found the folder. I'm the one who was tortured for it. I'm the one who pulled this phone out of the mansion. And by the old rule you just quoted, women aren't attacked at a summit. If I stand there, they have to listen." Tommaso looked at Salvatore, and in that look was the question he didn't say, "Who is she that you brought to my door?" Then he said, "You need muscle, You need someone to hold doors, watch exits, hit back if Caruso breaks the rules. How many men do you have left?" Salvatore looked at his brother, and for the first time in 5 years he told the truth without hiding it behind pride. "Nobody. I came here with a pregnant maid, and our father's old truck. That's all that's left of the Moretti Empire." Tommaso stared at him, then at Genevieve, then back at him, and he said, "You haven't crashed a party in 10 years. Salvatore met his eyes. "What do you mean?" Tommaso stood, went to the corner, grabbed a crowbar leaning there, rolled it once in his hand like a conductor's baton, and the first smile Genevieve had seen since Salvatore walked back into his life spread across Tommaso's grease-stained beard, wild and dangerous, the smile of a Moretti catching the scent of war. "Then dress up, big brother, because if we go like Morettis, and Genevieve watched the brothers look at each other and saw something between them that 5 years of distance and ego hadn't erased, something that wasn't love in the ordinary way, more like a chain made of blood and memory you could hate but never break. And she thought maybe family wasn't something you chose. Maybe it was something that chose you, even if you were an orphan girl who'd never belonged to any family at all. Genevieve found the roof of the scrapyard close to 11 at night. Climbing up an outdoor steel staircase she discovered, after looking for the bathroom and turning the wrong way, and when she stepped onto the flat roof coated in rust dust, what she saw wasn't a star-filled sky but the industrial sky of Gary, Indiana. Low clouds hanging heavy and reflecting the orange glow from the distant U.S. steel plant. No stars, no moon, only that dirty, mournful light of a city dying slowly, and Genevieve thought this sky looked like her life. Never clear enough to see anything beautiful, but still bright enough to keep walking. She sat on the roof edge with her legs dangling, her back against an iron railing, one hand resting on her belly, a habit she wasn't trying to hide anymore, and she listened to the steady thud of the car crusher below, a rhythm like the heartbeat of the iron beast Tommaso had built with oil-stained hands. Footsteps on the metal stairs made her turn, heavier than hers but slower than usual, and Salvatore stepped onto the roof, his left leg dragging slightly because the 12 stitches in his thigh were still fresh, a borrowed shirt from Tommaso too wide at the shoulders but sitting on him like armor anyway, and he saw her on the edge, paused for a beat, then walked over and sat beside her, leaving a palm's width between them, the distance they'd learned to keep all week, close enough to feel, far enough to feel safe. They sat for a while watching the dirty Gary sky, and the silence didn't feel awkward or demanding because they'd already passed the stage of needing to fill emptiness with words back in that penthouse study. Then Salvatore spoke, low and far away like he was talking to the clouds more than to her. My father was shot in Rosario on Taylor when I was 18. 3 shots. 2 in the chest, 1 in the head, in front of a full dining room. I got there while his blood was still wet on the tile. Genevieve didn't say anything, not "I'm sorry," because she knew apologies were weightless against pain old enough to turn to stone. Salvatore kept staring into the night. From that day I built walls, around myself, thicker every year, until nobody could get in and I couldn't get out. I told myself that was strength. But tonight, sitting here, I think maybe it was just another way of saying, I died on that restaurant floor with him, and the last 19 years have been a body that learned how to walk, talk, and give orders. Genevieve looked at him, really looked. Not at a Mafia boss or her rescuer or the man who promised her child the Moretti name, but at the 18-year-old boy who'd seen his father's blood on the floor and decided nobody would ever get close enough to hurt him again. She answered softly, steady. The first night after I left my 3rd foster home at 16, I slept in an abandoned Buick in a junk lot in South Englewood. Winter. No blanket. I wrapped myself in old newspapers and shook all night. In the morning I woke up alive and I thought it was a miracle. Then the second night I shook all night again and woke up alive again, and by the 10th night I stopped thinking it was a miracle and started thinking it was just stubbornness, like my body was too stubborn to die even when my mind sometimes wanted it to. Salvatore turned to her, and in the orange light reflected from the steel plant, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not cold control, not frozen rage, not sharp calculation, but something raw, fragile, the admission that he was cracked too. Human too. Just a man who'd gotten very good at pretending he wasn't. If I don't come back tomorrow, Salvatore said, even lower, almost a whisper, stay with Tommaso. He'll protect you. He's an idiot, but he keeps his word. Genevieve faced him and spoke without shaking, without fear, only certainty. You'll come back, because you owe me an answer. That night in the study I asked what I was and you couldn't answer. The next day you told me I wasn't a maid and you still couldn't answer. Then you called me a partner in the truck. But that still isn't the answer. Because I saw the way you looked at me through the smoke in the penthouse. And that wasn't how people look at a partner, so you'll come back because you still owe me. And Salvatore Moretti doesn't owe anyone. Salvatore studied her, and for the first time, she saw the corner of his mouth lift. Not the polite smile he wore like a weapon, not the dangerous smile he'd used on Franco, but something real, small, almost invisible if she weren't close enough to hear him breathe. He raised his hand slowly, where she could see it coming, giving her the space to pull away if she wanted. And he set his palm against her cheek, his thumb brushing the sharp line of her cheekbone the streets had carved into a blade, and she didn't retreat. She leaned into his hand by a millimeter, unconscious, like a flower turning toward light. "You're the only reason I want to survive tomorrow," he said. And it wasn't a confession dressed up like romance because Salvatore Moretti didn't know how to confess. It was just truth, bare and unvarnished. The truth of a man who'd built walls for 19 years and didn't understand how an orphaned maid had punched a hole straight through them. Then he leaned down, and she lifted her face, and their first kiss wasn't cinematic. Not hungry, not burning, just soft and trembling, his mouth touching hers for a few seconds while both of them shook. Him because the last time he'd kissed anyone with meaning was never. Her because the last time someone touched her without pain was 13 years ago, when her mother kissed her forehead before she slept over at a friend's, the last night before the fire. They pulled back with their foreheads touching, breathing, and neither of them spoke because they both knew tonight wasn't the time. Tonight was the night before war, and some things had to be saved for whatever came after. But the promise was there, placed between two trembling mouths on a scrapyard roof in Gary, Indiana, under a starless sky, and it was enough. In the morning, the scrapyard turned into the strangest dressing room the Chicago underworld had ever seen. Salvatore stood before a cracked mirror in the upstairs bathroom, wearing a black tux Tommaso had sent someone to buy at 4A. From the only place in Gary that stayed open for customers who didn't want names asked, the vest hiding bruises on his ribs, the trousers hiding the 12 stitches on his thigh, a perfect Windsor knot at his throat, and when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a wounded man. He saw the Moretti boss ready to reclaim his throne. Tommaso wore a charcoal suit the clerk swore was the biggest size in the store, and it still strained at the shoulders and came up short at the wrists, because nothing on earth was tailored for a man built like a warehouse door, and he scowled at his collar like a bull forced into a harness. But his eyes were bright, because he was a Moretti, and Morettis were born to walk into a room and make it go silent. Then Genevieve stepped out of the makeshift dressing room Agnes had arranged, because Agnes had arrived at dawn, driving 3 hours from Chicago with a garment bag she called the only thing I can still do for the girl, and inside was an emerald green evening dress, not new, the dress Salvatore's father's late wife had worn at her last party before she died, the one Agnes had kept in a closet for 30 years, and it fit Genevieve like it had been made for her. The green silk hugging her upper body, and falling softly from the waist to hide a 7-week belly, her copper-brown hair smoothed back by Agnes's careful hands. And when Genevieve stepped into the light with her spine straight, chin lifted, eyes burning with the same fire Salvatore had seen the first time she suggested breaking into the mansion, she didn't look like a maid shaking in the rain, or a starving girl eating porridge in a guest bed. She looked like a queen walking out of ash. Agnes stood in the doorway and cried, silent tears sliding down her lined cheeks, because in the 27-year-old girl, she saw the ghost of the woman who'd worn that dress 30 years ago, and she understood the Moretti line didn't die because it always found someone to carry it forward. They got into a black car Tommaso borrowed from one of his men. Salvatore in the back right, Genevieve in the back left. Tommaso driving because he said, "Nobody drives my car but me." And when they rolled out through the scrapyard gates toward Chicago, nobody spoke. Absolute silence. 3 people in the finest clothes of their lives, heading straight into a battle they might not return from. And the silence wasn't heavy. It was sacred, the silence of people who'd already said everything that mattered and had nothing left but action. Lyric Opera House stood in downtown Chicago like a cathedral built for power and lies, its white limestone facade washed in golden light, its interior a forest of gilt, red velvet, and crystal chandeliers hanging from a vaulted ceiling 15 meters high, scattering candle-like reflections over rows of plush seats where the most dangerous men in the city sat in suits worth more than cars. And tonight nobody had come to hear opera. Don Angelo Caruso stood on stage, 67, silver hair slicked back to perfection, a pale gray suit tailored in Milan, a silver rose pin on his lapel that he'd crowned as his personal symbol of peace, and he lifted a glass of cristal into the stage lights, his face arranged into a practiced grief he'd rehearsed in a mirror at least 10 times, his voice filling the hall with that perfectly controlled volume of a man who'd lied in public for decades. "Salvatore Moretti was a brother to all of us," Caruso said, his left hand pressed to his chest like his heart ached, but greed poisoned his heart. "He secretly colluded with a cartel beyond our borders, betrayed the council's trust, and his death, painful as it is the necessary cleansing of our organization." He paused, sipped champagne, let the silence sit exactly 3 seconds the way theater demanded, then lowered his tone by half a step, with that polished humility he'd sharpened over 40 years. I'm unworthy, but for the sake of our shared peace, I humbly accept stewardship of the Moretti territory and logistics routes until the council finds a lasting solution." In the front row, Salvatore's 4 trader captains nodded like puppets on cue: Mancini, Horowitz, Delgado, and Kieran Brennan, faces flat, eyes refusing to meet anyone's, because to look at anyone now would be to admit what they'd sold their souls for. The other dons sat behind them, some nodding, some frowning, some simply watching and calculating, because in this world, nobody trusted anyone. But everybody was excellent at pretending they did. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall burst open. Not eased, not careful, but kicked so hard, both doors slammed into the walls with a thunder that shook the theater and made champagne glasses tremble on their tables, and silence dropped across the room like a blade slicing the air. Absolute, total, the kind of silence that only happens when hundreds of dangerous men stop breathing at the same time. Salvatore Moretti walked in down the center aisle, black tuxedo, vest buttoned high to hide bruises on his ribs, perfect black tie, his face bruised but clean-shaven and sharp as a razor. He walked straight, spine upright, each step sounding on the wooden floor like a countdown. Not fast, not slow. The measured stride of a man who owned everything he was walking toward. On his left, Tommaso, death itself in a charcoal suit too tight for shoulders, built like a warehouse door, muscle swelling under fabric like a caged beast, his beard thick and his face unreadable, his eyes sweeping the room and tagging every exit, every guard, every threat in 2 flat seconds. And between them, Genevieve, emerald silk clinging to her upper body and falling softly from the waist, copper brown hair smoothed back straight like a blade, chin lifted, eyes locked on the stage without blinking, and she walked between 2 Moretti men, not like someone being protected, but like she belonged in that formation, by right, by blood spilled, and by fire survived. Caruso's champagne glass trembled in his hand, foam spilling over his fingers without him noticing. "A ghost," he whispered, loud enough for the stage mic to catch and broadcast, and the word slithered through the hall like a snake hiss. "I'll let you save the eulogy, Caruso," Salvatore said, his voice not needing a microphone yet reaching the back row anyway, because it was built to cut through any space. "I'm not dead." Caruso staggered a step back on stage, the glass slipping from his grip, shattering on the wood, champagne splashing his shoes, and for the first time in 40 years he yelled without control. "Guards! Shoot him! Shoot him now!" But the guards lining the aisles didn't move, not because they were loyal to Salvatore, but because they were looking at Tommaso, the man who'd just cracked his knuckles and made the dry sound of snapping kindling, and they were doing the math in their heads, whether Caruso's pay was worth facing that, and the answer was obviously no. Genevieve stepped forward past Salvatore, and the entire hall stared at her, an orphaned 27-year-old former maid, pregnant, walking the center aisle of an opera house toward the Council of 5 Families, and in her hand was a small remote Voss had linked to the theater's projector system before the summit began, because Tommaso had sent one of his men in earlier posing as an audio tech to install a wireless receiver into the stage projector feed. She pressed the button. The massive screen behind the stage, the one meant to display opera subtitles, flared to life, and it didn't show an aria or a libretto. It showed messages, hundreds of them, Franco and Caruso, scrolling slowly enough for every man to read, wire instructions with the Cayman account numbers, photos of forged documents being built, the step-by-step plan to depose Salvatore, all time-stamped, all embedded with metadata, all impossible to deny, displayed on a screen 3 meters tall and 5 meters wide, at a resolution so sharp every letter looked carved by a knife. Caruso stared at the screen, his face draining from white to ash, and he turned toward the council with his mouth open and nothing coming out, because there wasn't a single sentence on earth that could bridge what he'd just said and what was now burning behind him in light. Genevieve stood in the aisle facing the council and spoke, loud, clear, unshaking, the kind of voice nobody in that room expected to come from a thin orphan in a borrowed dress. He didn't just target a boss. He ordered a woman tortured. He had cigars pressed into her skin for 2 days. He ordered a child not yet born to be erased. And he broke the sacred rule you men swore to keep. Family is untouchable. But to Caruso, family is something to burn if it's in the way. She paused, and in the silence that followed, she lifted her wrist into the chandelier light. 12 cigar burns, round and precise, bright on living skin, proof you couldn't Photoshop, couldn't forge, couldn't deny. It ran through the room like fire across gasoline. A low murmur rose, dark and dangerous, the first roll of thunder gathering, because the old law was absolute. Family was untouchable. Women and children were the line even monsters didn't cross. And Caruso had crossed it, not for war, not for honor, but for greed. And in this world, greed could sometimes be forgiven, but breaking the sacred rule never was. The council shifted, each Don's gaze cutting from the screen to Caruso, and in their eyes the political calculation and neutral diplomacy were gone, replaced by something older and more primitive. The anger of men with wives and children asleep at home, realizing the man on stage would burn them all to keep a throne. Caruso watched his empire collapse in the faces across the auditorium. He watched the fake loyalty he'd bought with money dissolve like mist in sunlight. And in a moment of pure, cornered desperation, he shoved his hand inside his vest and yanked out a nickel-plated pistol he'd hidden in a leather holster under his arm, the gun he carried to every summit because he never trusted the old law to protect him. But before he could raise the barrel to chest height, a silver blur cut through the air so fast nobody in the room could tell what it was, until the sound of flesh tearing and wood splintering hit at the same time. Tommaso's combat knife went through the back of Caruso's right hand and pinned it to the wooden lectern behind him. Driven so deep, the blade sank a fraction of an inch into the oak, and the pistol slipped from his fingers and clattered across the stage floor while Caruso screamed. A sharp, high scream that shattered against the vaulted ceiling and fell back into the silent hall. And that was the final sound of the Caruso reign. Not gunfire and not applause, but the cry of a greedy old man nailed to oak by the very violence he'd planted. Salvatore stepped onto the stage, slow. Each footfall rang on the wood like a countdown, like an execution drum from a medieval square. And the theater was so quiet you could hear the fabric of his trousers brush as he moved, his left leg dragging slightly from the 12 stitches. But he didn't let anyone see pain because Salvatore Moretti didn't bleed in front of enemies. He saved pain for when he was alone. He stopped in front of Caruso and looked down at the old man kneeling at the lectern, his right hand immobilized and pinned, blood running down his arm and soaking the sleeve of his Milan suit, his face gone the color of wet ash. Salvatore didn't look at the knife. He didn't look at the blood. He looked into Caruso's eyes, straight down to the bottom, where the only thing left wasn't power or strategy, but the animal fear of a creature that knew it had lost. Salvatore bent closer and whispered, just loud enough for Caruso to hear. But the silence of the auditorium carried every word outward like ripples on a lake. This city is mine. It's always been mine. And the woman you called trash, the orphan maid you ordered handled, she's the queen who just ended your reign. Then he straightened and turned his back on Caruso, because a beaten man didn't deserve another second of his gaze. And he looked out over the seats, looked at Genevieve standing in the aisle in her emerald dress, spine straight, eyes on him, and he reached his hand out. Not a command, not a pull, not a lead, just an open hand, palm up, an invitation. And Genevieve stepped forward, climbed the stage steps with steady feet, emerald silk whispering with each step, and she placed her hand in his, her small hand fitting perfectly into his larger one, the hand that had once trembled in the rain outside the bus station, now tight and warm, and she stood beside him on the Lyric Opera House stage and looked down at the sea of the most dangerous men in Chicago, and she didn't tremble, didn't bow her head, didn't hide her eyes. She met face after face head on, because she'd walked through a hell these men only dared to speak about in darkness. She'd been burned, thrown away, called trash, and she was still standing here, and nobody in that room was more frightening than what she'd already survived. One by one, each Don bowed. Not only because they feared Salvatore, though they did. Not only because they respected Tommaso, though his body demanded respect. They bowed because the old law had been restored, because the lawbreaker had been punished, and because the woman on that stage had reminded them that even in a world built from shadow, there were borders the light would not allow to be erased. The war was over. The king had returned. And beside the king stood the woman nobody saw coming until she rose out of ash. On the drive back, in the black car cutting through the Chicago night, Tommaso drove in silence up front, sometimes flicking his eyes to the rearview mirror, and then looking away with half a smile he'd deny if anyone asked. In the back seat, Genevieve reached over and took Salvatore's hand, gentle, like she was still asking permission, and he closed his grip around hers, tight, like he was holding the only thing worth more than an empire. She turned to him and asked, her voice quiet but steady, the question she'd asked 3 times and never once received a real answer for. "What am I to you now?" Salvatore looked at her, and this time he didn't go silent, didn't dodge, didn't fasten a cuff button to buy himself time. He said, "You're home, Genevieve. The first time in my life I've had a home. I spent 37 years not knowing what that felt like until you curled up in that armchair in my study at 3 in the morning and told me you didn't want to be anyone's territory, and I realized I didn't want you to be territory. I want you to be home, because territory I can lose, but home I'd die to keep." Genevieve cried. But these tears weren't like the ones before. They weren't fear like that night at the bus station. They weren't exhaustion like on the penthouse floor. They weren't release like in the lobby after the break-in. These were the tears of a girl orphaned at 14, drifted through 3 foster homes and 13 years without anyone calling her name in the morning, finally hearing someone say she was home, she was belonging, she was something worth dying to keep. She cried without sound because the old habit was still there. But this time, she didn't bite her lip to stop it. She let the tears fall, because for the first time, the tears weren't pain, they were healing. Salvatore lifted his hand and wiped the tears off her cheek with his thumb, so gently she barely felt it. Then he placed his palm over her belly, warm through the emerald silk, and they both fell quiet as they felt something underneath. Not big enough to kick yet, but real enough to believe. The child Franco called handled. The child Caruso tried to erase. A child born not from love the way the world defined it, but a child who would grow inside a love nobody expected, could take root between storms, between ash, inside the Chicago underworld, because sometimes the strongest flowers don't grow in gardens. They push through cracks in concrete. And that child would carry the Moretti name not because of blood, but because of choice. The choice of a man deciding protection wasn't only power but also love, and the choice of a woman deciding survival wasn't only not dying, but daring to trust again after the world taught her trust was dangerous. And that was how a mafia boss found his redemption trembling on a park bench in a Chicago storm. Salvatore and Genevieve's story reminds us that sometimes the strongest alliances aren't signed in boardrooms, they're forged in bad weather. That loyalty is the only currency that doesn't lose value, and that no matter where you come from, penthouse or gutter, what decides who you are isn't where you started. It's how many times you choose to stand back up after every fall. If this story reached you, if you saw yourself in Genevieve, or in Salvatore, or in any moment between darkness and light, please hit like and share this video with someone who needs to hear they're not alone, because every share is a way of telling the world that stories of healing deserve to travel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, so you don't miss our next stories every day. I want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Which moment touched you the most? And do you believe that in real life, in the storms each of us is walking through, there's still someone waiting to take your hand the way Salvatore took Genevieve's? Write it in the comments below because I read every line and my heart is always listening to yours. Thank you for being here with us to the very end. I wish you and your family strong health, days that feel lighter, peace that stays, and love that keeps finding you. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video. And remember that in Chicago, the deadliest storms don't come from the sky. They come from the people you trust. But redemption can come the same way, sometimes from the place you least expect.